الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Continuing our lessons in the practical guide to seeking Islamic knowledge. Last week we spoke about some advice in relation to memorization and also in relation to some of the stories of the pious predecessors, the Imams who had beginnings in other than seeking knowledge, and the encouragement for a student not to give up or to be disheartened if they're starting late. Inshallah, today I want to talk about some different pieces of advice for the student knowledge that could help them in the way that they are going to obtain the knowledge, but also some of the advice to ulama, the scholars, they give in terms of how to collect or gather this knowledge. We spoke about before when it comes to issues like fiqh or even aqidah or any subject in Islam, you always start off with the mas'ala, the issue that you're studying at hand. And we said that this issue that you're studying, you try to first conceive it properly. What are the ulama discussing? What's the discussion at hand? And then you move from there towards the different opinions that are available amongst the scholars. And then you try to find the evidences and how they achieve those evidences. And ultimately you get a conclusion of some sort. But one of the most important things for the student when they're studying any issue is to be mindful of the scope of the discussion in the beginning. And that requires that they spend some time gathering and researching the different views on the matter before they make a conclusion. This could be a fiqh issue, it could be an aqidah issue, a creedal issue, a jurisprudence issue, tafsir issue, exegesis of the Quran. It doesn't necessarily matter what issue at hand, but it mostly occurs in fiqh, jurisprudence, because there tends to be lots of differences of opinion. So the first step then, you have to conceive what is the issue at hand, what are we discussing? And then check to see the different views that are available before you commit to one view, or you believe one view to be stronger than another view. And this is because before you find out if a view is stronger, you have to know what the different views are. And that's why the scholars are very keen on mentioning the gathering of different viewpoints. I want to mention some advice Shaykh Salih al-Shaykh Hafidhullah Ta'ala. He mentions about doing this. So for example, he says, let's say it's a fiqh issue. You're studying something in fiqh. He says the first thing you have to know is what the matter or the issue you're studying at hand. What's this mas'ala? What's the issue? Example, he says, let's say you're studying that on the day of Arafah in Hajj, is it considered a condition or necessary for someone to stand at Arafah before the zawal, before the zenith? Or is it must that they stand, right, the entire time, and including after the zenith? This is an issue that is in the books, for example, fiqh. It comes to Arafah and Hajj, when you stand at Arafah, the Arafah that people are standing on, is it considered acceptable to stand at Arafah until the zawal, so before the zawal up until the zenith, so the sun reaching the high noon? Or am I supposed to stand from that time, before that time, all the way through? And for a complete standing. But this is an example, right? It could be any other issue. To look for, see if is this thing halal or haram. That's another example. This food is halal or haram. Or you want to study, for example, is this action sunnah or not? Whatever issue you're studying, first you have to, we said, contain the issue, the mas'ala, within the parameters of the scholars. For example, in this case, is it considered acceptable or not? This is what is meant by mas'ala. Once you have the question you're researching, then you have to go to the books of fiqh. And this is the same for books of aqidah or Arabic language, whatever issue you're studying. But in the fiqh, for example, because there's so much difference of opinion, the Shaykh is going to show us steps that we can take. Because a lot of people, when they study something, they get the one opinion and khalas. MashaAllah, I studied the issue. No, you only study one qawl. You only have one opinion. You don't know the other opinions, so you're not necessarily study the issue. You just take an opinion you found, the first one available. And this is what some people do. But if a student is trying to study something, I want to figure out different viewpoints. I want to first see the scope of the views. Then I want to commit to an opinion which I believe, Allahu Alam, is stronger or not. So for example, he says, once you figure out the issue you're trying to study, then you will go to the books of fiqh, and the books of fiqh are divided across the different madhahib, and there are 5 madhabs. 4 of them we know, right? Abu Hanifa, the Hanafis, the Shafi'iyya, for the Malikiyya, the Malikis, and the Shafi'iyya, and the Hanabila. Those are the 4 madhabs. Then there's the last one, the Zahiriyya. Zahiriyya, what sometimes you find, are taking the view of the ulama before, but they're not coming into one madhab. So sometimes they call them ulama ahlul hadith, or maybe you could just say the madhab of Zahiri. And the idea is these 5 views are 5 madhabs. And the scholars who have different views. You want to figure out what the different opinions are available on these different madhabs. Why? So you figure out how much differing is there. Is there agreement or is it differing? So for example, I'm trying to find out about Arafah. How long do you have to stand there? And I say, okay, 1, 2, 3, all 4 madhabs or 5 madhabs, what did they say? If they all agreed upon something, it's consensus, ijma'. Khalas, the issue is done. But in most cases, they're not going to agree, they're going to differ. So the question, this point the Shaykh saying is you go into these books to figure out, okay, each madhab, what's their position? There are some books that do all of this for you. Or you can go to the various books and try to find out the different viewpoints. And the reason why you're doing this, to figure out what is the differing to begin with. Because most of us, we don't adhere to one madhab, right? Most of us, we don't adhere to one madhab, we adhere to the strongest opinion based on the Quran and Sunnah. And even if you adhere to a particular madhab, you will like to know the other views. Because later on, you might present this issue to somebody and say, well, there's this madhab and that madhab. So once you figure out the different views of the madhabs, the different views within the different madhabs is called khilaf al-ali. It's called a higher differing. And what does this mean? Abu Hanifa could say this, Malik could say that, Shafi'i could say this, Imam Ahmad said that. 4 different opinions, or Ibn Hazm will come and say something else. If there's 5 opinions, then there's 5 opinions. If there's 3 opinions, there's 3 opinions. Why do you want to get the opinions in the beginning? So you understand how many there are. This will save you time later, because when you heard about an opinion on this topic, you say, oh, I know there's 3 opinions. I heard about 3 opinions, and I studied them. When I studied the issue, I studied these 3 opinions, and then I took one of the 3. Versus somebody who studies, like how many of us might do it, and this is different between a student of knowledge and a layperson. A layperson, he will study based on what comes his way. Somebody told him one opinion, khalas, that's the only opinion he knows. Someone else tells him a second opinion. By the time he learns all 4 opinions, he keeps changing his opinion. And that's what most of us happens. We keep changing opinions, say, what's going on here? How many opinions are there? Well, you could have saved your time for us figuring out there's that many different. Because you're studying this issue, you're not just practicing. You want to know in the beginning. So you go and you check the different madhabs, or you can check certain comparative fiqh books to tell you all 4 or 5 opinions. And sometimes they'll tell you opinions of scholars even before that. Again, if there's more opinions. But generally you group the opinions, the groups, group 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. Then, once you have the scope of these different opinions, you want to go upwards, higher. What were the Sahaba saying about it? So Salih says you got to then go upwards to see the earlier scholars, before the madhabs, what were they saying? And usually you find that the Sahaba differed likewise. Because the 4 madhabs wouldn't differ if the people before them didn't. So you want to check, okay, what was the Sahaba saying? And this is key. Because ultimately we want an opinion that is found with the Sahaba. We always say Kitab al-Sunnah al-Fahm Salaf. So where is the Salaf? Where are the earlier scholars? So you're going to say, okay, in this madhab, this Imam took that view, that's why Abu Hanifa went this way. And this Imam took that view, that's why Shafi'i went that way. See this? You're going to go forward. So you start off with the 4 or 5 opinions, then you go upwards to say, okay, these madhabs, do they have a predecessor for each madhab? And usually there is the answer, yes. This madhab that, this one that. Some might not have, but you try to figure out what were the Sahaba on this issue. Once you have a scope like this, you start to see that the various opinions are typically, again, broken into 4 or 5, whatever views you found. And then you will try to look for the evidences of these different madhabs. And ultimately, if you have more knowledge, you can discern a strong one. And if you're not able to, then you can take the opinion of a trustworthy scholar from those views. Scholar from the scholars you take, you'd be trustworthy. And you say, okay, I'm going to go with that madhab. Because you're maybe not knowledgeable enough to say which one is stronger. But at least you've taken an acceptable view of the views available. How about the contemporary scholars? You see, the contemporary scholars, they follow the earlier scholars. So likewise, they're going to be descending downwards. So if the 4 or 5 madhabs, when you look down, Ibn Uthaymin will be on this side, Ibn Baz on this side, Al-Albani on that side. So they're only going to be where the other opinions were. They're not going to be some other opinion, or sometimes you could find some scholars come with new opinion, but that's very rare. And the reason why it's important is then you're seeing a chain. If you take this contemporary sheikh's view, it's actually this madhab's view, which is actually this sahabi's view, which is actually based on this proof. The strength of that kind of study will allow you to also understand the differences that happen in fiqh. Despite the difference, you want to study it properly, so you're not committing to the views just of one scholar. Obviously, it's a line of scholars. And when you're studying an issue, you study it this way. Why is it valuable to do this for a student of knowledge? You understand also how views arise, but also you know the scope of the views, so you can also understand which view do you want to adhere to. What kind of views do you share with people when they ask you about the issue? Imagine you never studied the issue, you only know one view. You're not really in a position to tell someone the different views. You can't really tell them what is right, you can just tell them what you know. But if you study different views, you can say, well, here's all the different views. Here's the different views I came across. All of these are acceptable. The early scholars have them. Someone has a choice to choose them. And again, someone's not going to choose based on their whims, not based on who they think is stronger, based on the knowledge or age. There's different ways to determine which opinion you think is stronger. So Sheikh Salih and Sheikhs mentioned this. So this is how a student will research these issues. And he'll go every issue like that. And of course, when they get more knowledge, then they will go deeper into the different views and figure out which one is categorically right or stronger and which one is more weaker. And that will be an assessment based on the evidence and based on their rationale, al-usul al-fiqh. So in the beginning, you're not necessarily committing to correcting and weakening views. You're just trying to figure out the scope of the different. So for example, someone comes and tells you how many tahiyyat al-masjid is wajib or not. Well, you're going to say, well, there's two opinions. One group, a minority group of scholars says wajib, majority says mustahab. How much you know? You might say that I think it's wajib, but you know that someone else holds the view that's mustahab. At least you can offer someone that much. You know more about the opinions, you can offer them maybe some of the evidences, how they differ. But maybe you're not knowledgeable enough to say this is stronger than that opinion. Because you might not have the tools to figure out that yet. But at least you have this much. Better than you just saying, I heard that tahiyyat al-masjid is wajib. And later someone comes and tells you, Jumhur ulama say, the majority of scholars say it's not wajib. You're going to be like shocked. What is this? Majority said it's not wajib. Well, you should have known that before time, right? If you studied this, you would have known that. And the reason why it's important is that you're not going to be easily flustered. Because you're like, I know that, but I still take the opinion it's wajib. Different, right? Someone says, I know the majority say it's not, but I think the evidence suggests it is. So the difference between this is that someone needs to understand that differing, especially in fiqh, because it's wide, you try to make parameters around every different. Views that are very weak, you just discard them. The views that are legitimate, you try to record them, you try to at least be aware of them. And sometimes you might not even remember who said it. You might not remember different scholars who adhere to it, but you know there is a differing. And this is valuable. Why? Because it also shows you the value of studying properly, but also the benefit of having methodology in study. Now, compare this now, for example, if someone's going to research something in Aqeedah. Creedal issues are a little bit different. Because the creedal issues, you start without going to the earlier scholars, you might start with the contemporary scholars. Or so, for example, some books like Shaykh Islam ibn Taymiyyah and his works. You first try to figure out what does Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah say on this issue in Aqeedah. And then you try to figure out the earlier scholars, of course, which is communicating to us, how they reached that same conclusion. But you wouldn't start with them first. Why? Because the Salaf, the way that they discussed issues in the early books of Aqeedah is not the way the latter scholars did. Latter scholars made things easy. Categorize things, they put principles down. For the early scholars, they use fantastic evidences, very good proofs, but their writings are a little more difficult to access. That's a mistake then. If someone tries to say, I'm going to study the Aqeedah, I'm going to go right to the books of Salaf. No, you wouldn't know the principles that they're operating from. So you go to latter scholars to make it easy, then you go upwards. You see, for example, scholars say start with the contemporary scholars, then work your way. And you work to Shaykh Islam ibn Taymiyyah, etc. Then you go up. You don't stop there, you keep going. But you don't start the other way around. Why? Because you might go to the big books of the Imams, and you never understood anything. You don't know how they derive that view. Where did they get the evidence for that? Where's the principle? And the latter scholars try to do that for you. So these methodologies are very important because ultimately they will help you as a student ground yourself in different issues, but also study things and study them well. Because ultimately every issue you study, you hope to study once, ideally, but sometimes you'll study something again and again and again to review it, to maybe even see if your opinion was right or wrong. The more knowledge you have, then we review the same issue again. Look, at this time, the way you're reviewing is different than the first time. The first time you took that opinion because the sheikh said that and that sheikh said this. You trust this sheikh more than that sheikh. The next time you carry around, you say, well, look at the evidence. I think that guy, this sheikh is stronger in this issue. But I looked at the evidence, I think their argument is stronger. And that's the beauty of fiqh and reviewing knowledge. The more you learn, the better you're going to be able to do that. But in the beginning, you just want to be able to have these kinds of researches available, even in your own notes as a student. And so what you do is when you're looking at an issue, you read, for example, in a book, the sheikh said this issue. The question, the first thing should come to your head is there a different opinion on this or not? Why? So that you will not become later confused if you heard another sheikh say something else. Because you knew in the beginning the sheikhs differed. But some of us, because we never studied this way, anytime you hear a new opinion, you get confused. And you get probably even more anxious and say, oh, I thought this was clear. Again, you have to understand, when we're talking about Aqidah, most of Aqidah's agreements, the finer details, they can be different, the very fine details. Fiqh, majority of fiqh is agreement, and there are some differing in different issues. For example, everyone agrees in Salah and the 5 pillars, and they differ in some of the details. But the idea is a student knowledge, he wants to be able to study these issues independently. This will also allow them to grow their knowledge because he has to research. The student knowledge has to research. And anyone can do research. You don't have to, for example, be a specialist. You can go read many books or more than one book to see the different views. Okay, it's important to do some research. And this will allow you to also better prepare yourself to appreciate the views of scholars and not be a layperson. Because a layperson who doesn't know these things, student knowledge, you should be aware of differences and also how to deal with them, and later on how to interact with them. And that leads to another thing, which is that when it comes to understanding the evidences and studying the deen, it's also important that we make sure that we're staying with the works of the ulama, the scholars, and we're progressing alongside them or along with their curriculum or their works. So for example, if we're studying something, we study the works of the scholars, then we go to another group of scholars, and you just keep going like this. You don't want to be studying any issue independent of the scholars, and you don't want us to understand any issue without the scholars there. Because it's not about Quran and Sunnah only, it's about the understanding. And this is what most of the people today, they keep forgetting. No one is differing in Quran and Sunnah except for the fringe. And Quran is will come and say, no Quran, no Sunnah. We say, yeah, well, that guy's out to lunch, right? He's out of there. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about the people who most people agree with Quran and Sunnah. Where is it differing? How we're understanding this. So one of the rules, any issue you study, you have to have an imam. Somebody who preceded you to that opinion and that statement you hold. So not allowed to take an ayah or a hadith and derive a benefit, no one preceded you in it. First of all, is it possible? Right? So someone to read the Quran and hadith, they come with an opinion no one ever said before. It's possible he can produce maybe some kind of istinbat, some kind of derivative on maybe tafsir or something like this. Or you do tadabbur, you might find a benefit. But in talking about fiqh or basic rulings, you're not going to precede the imams before us. You're not. In fact, if you find you're the only one who said it, probably means it's not right. Right? And this is one of the problems we have today, that people, when they read the Quran and Sunnah, where's the biggest problem? They don't read the commentaries of the scholars on those same ayat and hadith. And that's the benefit I want to talk about as well, understanding that every ayah, every hadith, there's somebody who explained it from the imams. You must return back to their explanations. You're not allowed to explain a hadith by yourself. You can't understand the ayah by yourself. And this is one of the problems you find. People, they do because they take the zahir nas, the apparent feature of the text, forgetting that there's another text that you don't know about, which can change the meaning of that text. So scholars, they say then, when it comes to the books of hadith, for every book of hadith, there's a commentary that is reliable. For every, of course, the Quran, there are many tafasir, exegesis. For the books of language, so every knowledge is a set of books. But we'll talk about hadith, for example, because it tends to be where a lot of the confusion sometimes comes. When you study the hadith, we study like books like 40 hadith al-Nawawi, the books like Bulugh al-Maram or Umdat al-Ahkam, all these books of hadith, Riyadh al-Salihin. Each book has a commentary. You have to return to those commentaries to figure out what the scholars are saying. Because you may read a hadith and derive something from it that no one preceded you to it. So you want to check, is that correct understanding of the hadith or not? But sometimes we understand the hadith one way and we figure out actually there's a different way of understanding it. So always we make sure that we don't have an issue we studied and there's no imam who said that thing that we derived. That's when we said before, whenever you're writing the knowledge, it's what is the issue, what is the evidence, how did they reach it, and who said it. Who said it? Yes, because we're not going to take me and you as imams, right? We're not imams. So if I said this is what I read in hadith, it doesn't matter. I could have misread it. So always you have to have an imam. And somebody could bring you an ayah or hadith, and it's not evidence. Because not every ayah hadith can be used as istishhad, for the evidence, to use as evidence. And this is the mistake you find some people open the hadith and say this hadith. You think every hadith is taken this way? Just on al-Zahir al-Nas, there's no second hadith, third hadith, could be da'if hadith. You don't know these things. So one of the problems we have is this. Some people in the beginning, they're benefiting from something. Sometimes you think you understood something, this is good. Go and check who said it before you. إياكم يا أحمد said إياكم. Beware of speaking. تتكلم في مسألة ليس لك فيها إمام. Beware of speaking about an issue you have no imam who preceded you in it. So for example, let's say it's a fiqh ruling. That's the easy one. You have a fatwa you're following. Okay, who said it? Let's say this imam. Easy. Okay, now for example, it's an issue in Aqidah. Okay, who said that? Who used this wording? Okay, this imam said it. I read it in his book. See, then you're fine. Whenever you have an imam, you're safe. And again, it's a good imam, not just any imam, right? Because we know some imams are, unfortunately, they're not guided. So you can't just say, I found an imam. Hey, you got to check the right imams. Not anybody. And this is one of the things that differentiates also correct views and non-correct views. You can source those views from earlier scholars. So ulama always say, when it comes to hadith especially, you must make sure you read the commentaries of the hadith. And for the 6 books of hadith, there are commentaries, majority of them are from Ahlul Hind. And that's a fact. The majority of the books of hadith, the commentaries are written by the scholars of India and Pakistan. Not for the Sunan mainly, but even other books. But the Sunan mainly, it's them. And so scholars, they mention this, that you should know these books, and you should know the reason that these books have precedence, because they're correct interpretations, but also they explain the whole book. So you find a hadith, you find their commentary. Find the hadith, you find their commentary. First you check if it's authentic, the hadith, then you check the commentary. And even if the hadith could be weak, sometimes you can check the benefit to see if the meaning is correct. Right? So not every book, every hadith is weak, has no benefit. Some hadith are weak and their meaning is fine, because somewhere else in the Quran and Sunnah supports it, so you take it. But the key is to make sure that you check who commented on it, because this will save a lot of problems, but also allow you to understand the scope of the differing or the way that the scholars understood the hadith. Let's talk about some of the best books of hadith that somebody should go back to. For the books of hadith, the scholars, they mentioned there's many, but we'll mention for each subject. For hadith, let's talk about Sahih al-Bukhari. Scholars for the vast majority mention Fath al-Bari of Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani is the best book. Look on the commentary of Sahih al-Bukhari. Fath al-Bari of Hafid Ibn Hajar. Although Hafid Ibn Rajab, he started the book first, he has his own Fath al-Bari, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, but he did not finish it. He started around Kitab al-Janaza, or Janais. So Ibn Rajab, some scholars say Ibn Rajab's Bukhari is better than Ibn Hajar's, if he were to complete it. And it's true, if you read his sharh, you say, subhanAllah, if he finished this sharh, it's probably unprecedented, the way that he brings the fawaid. But Ibn Hajar, altogether, his is considered the best one, because the length of time he spent writing it, and also the amount of benefits. Fath al-Bari, brothers and sisters, is an independent library by itself. When I say it, Shaykh Muqbil said, rahimahullah, it's an independent library. It's true. There are issues there Ibn Hajar talks about. If you can sit there alone, any fiqh, any issue, he'll bring you everything you need of the hadith, of the different viewpoints, so you can start reading. Because the amount of resources he used to gather that book, today we don't have them. We don't have what he had. So Ibn Hajar's Fath al-Bari, again, a very famous book, but just read it. Right? Read some commentary and just enjoy the benefits. So that's the best one when it comes to Sahih Bukhari. So if someone wants to check, there's many commentaries, but if someone says Ibn Hajar said in Fath al-Bari, on that hadith, that's pretty authoritative. And if not, that's a big deal. When it comes to Imam Muslim's Sahih, then the Sharh of Imam al-Nawawi. Imam Nawawi's commentary of Muslims considered the most authoritative to most of the scholars, although there are others, but his is the most popular and has a lot of benefit. There are some mistakes in it. Both Ibn Hajar and Imam Nawawi, they made some mistakes in some issues of Aqidah, so the scholars highlighted them usually. But besides that, the vast majority of the book is excellent. So we have to be mindful of that, though. There are some mistakes in Aqidah because they fell into some of the mistakes of Asha'ira without knowing. Right? Not unwillingly, either because they took from earlier books. There's explanations as to how they reached that. But in general, besides that, it's beneficial. And you find the scholars, when they want to comment on a hadith in Muslim, the first one they go to is Imam Nawawi's Sharh. Then they might get another one. So there are contemporary explanations, some that we have here, and the others. But you want to read the most popular one first. If you're going to read only one commentary, read that one. And the reason why it's important to go to the best one, so you get the most benefit. But if you have time, you might read multiple, see different views and different benefits. The third one now, Sunan at-Tirmidhi. So they mention, some of the scholars they mention two. So Tuhfat al-Ahwadhi of Imam al-Mubarak Furi, Abdul Mubarak Furi. Tuhfat al-Ahwadhi is called. They usually cite him as being the best one. And some of them they mention others. So this explanation, Abdurrahman al-Mubarak Furi, rahimahullah, I think we spoke about his biography before. He's the teacher of Taqiyuddin Hilali, the author of the Noble Quran translation. Abdurrahman al-Mubarak Furi, rahimahullah. So Tuhfat al-Ahwadhi is considered by many scholars the best one, and some of them they put Ibn Arabi Maliki's book, Arad al-Ahwadhi. It's another book. But again, the scholars they differed, right? So, but usually you see many of them saying that book, Abdurrahman al-Mubarak Furi. That's a region in, right? Mubarak Fur. So his explanation, Tuhfat al-Ahwadhi, fi Sharh Sunan at-Tirmidhi. Again, when you see his explanation, he's Ahlul Hadith, he'll bring you the Quran, the Hadith, the scholar's explanation, very detailed. And because his creed is also good, he has the correct creed, he will not make any issues, right? Although some scholars, they did write some notes here and there, but generally he's going to teach you the Aqidah, the correct Aqidah. For Abu Dawood, Sunan Abi Dawood, Awn al-Ma'bud, the book called Awn al-Ma'bud, Sharh Sunan Abi Dawood of Imam Shams al-Haq Azim Abadi, or sometimes they say Shams al-Haq al-Abadi. Okay, so it's called Awn al-Ma'bud. So usually if you put a hadith into Google and you look for a commentary, you'll get those books anyways. You notice that, right? If you look for it, you'll find in the list of commentaries anyways. So you just click it. So the reason why those commentaries come up, because those are the good commentaries. Awn al-Ma'bud. Now again, there are many other commentaries, but we're just saying these are the ones scholars say are the best in them. So obviously you can read others, but it's good to know that. And then when it comes to Sunan al-Nasa'i, there are many. Some of the scholars, they usually either mention Abu Hassan al-Sindi. He has a ta'liqat or hashiyah, small notes or gloss on Sunan al-Nasa'i. But I think it's not all the hadith, he has many of them. Abu Hassan al-Sindi, his name is. Also, Imam al-Suyuti has a commentary. But in today's time, the biggest and best of them is that by Sheikh Muhammad Admi Ethiopi. His explanations of 45, I think, volumes. I don't think there's anything after that better. I think we have it there. Wallahu alam. Up there. All that over there. That one is khalas. That's sufficient. So imams like that, with our time, brothers, khalas. He's the most comprehensive explanation. Muhammad Admi Ethiopi, rahimahullah, rahmatu wasi'ah, from the imams of Mecca. His explanation takes what the ulama did before and he adds more. Because many scholars didn't pay attention deeply to the Sunan of Imam al-Nasa'i as much as the other books. So you notice that some books have light treatment, some have deep. So anyways, his sharh is more comprehensive, but you usually find scholars quoting that one, or the commentary of Imam al-Suyuti, or Abu Hassan al-Sindi. And Sunan ibn Majah, likewise, Abu Hassan al-Sindi again. Abu Hassan al-Sindi has ta'liqat, notes on Sunan ibn Majah. And some of the scholars today, they try to comment on the same books again. But scholars, they usually mention these ones because they're the most common. And again, of the 4 Sunan, all of them are Ahlul Hadith. All of them from Pakistan, India area. Abu Hassan al-Sindi, his commentary on Ibn Majah. Then there's a book called Mishkat al-Masabih. Many of us, especially the Indo-Pak community, they know that book. Mishkat al-Masabih is considered like a compilation of many ahadith. It's kind of like Riyadh al-Salihin, but it's not. It has other hadith, but it's kind of like that. It gathers a group of hadith, fadail, rewards, ahkam, everything together. And there's a really good commentary on it by Mullah Ali Qari, his name is. Mullah Ali Qari. And this sheikh, he has a commentary on this book. It's really useful because he covers the whole book. Mirqat al-Mafatih is called. Sharh Mishkat al-Masabih. And if you go to Mishkat al-Masabih, you see this book, Sheikh Albani, others, they did checkings on the book. But his commentary, Mullah Ali Qari, is considered very useful. Because not only comments all the hadith, but also he brings some of the earliest scholars with the isnad, and he covers the whole book. And that's a book you find today. Many people cite. Some will say the book Hadith Mishkat Masabih. So you just go and see what Mullah Ali Qari said first. Because again, some of the other groups might cite the book, but they don't know the commentary. Then there are books that are like the Muslim Imam Ahmed. Is there a commentary on Muslim Imam Ahmed? There is. Right? There are ta'liqat, but usually, right, they're not that heavy. They're more like light. You can find those as well. But I want to talk about other books for a second. When it comes to Riyadh al-Salihin, some of the ulama say the best commentary is Ibn Allan, commentary Dalil al-Falihin. Many of us might never heard that book. Dalil al-Falihin of Ibn Allan, Sharh Riyadh al-Salihin. He's a student of Imam Ibn Hajar, if I remember correctly. And the way that he comments on the book is very, very, very good. Because he goes deep into the wordings of Riyadh al-Salihin and the meanings and the rulings. So it's more like an academic commentary, less than just commenting on the hadith. Although in our contemporary explanations, they are good, but his is very technical. It's called Dalil al-Falihin, Sharh Riyadh al-Salihin, Ibn Allan. Really good if you read it. But in today's time, Sharh Ibn Uthaymeen, a must read. Sharh Ibn Uthaymeen. Today's time, Ibn Uthaymeen, Sharh Riyadh Salihin, a book anybody, doesn't matter what level of knowledge, can read it and benefit. Fantastic book. Because the way the Shaykh explains the hadith, rahimahullah, very contemporary, very detailed, and very useful. Extremely useful. The Shaykh Uthaymeen, who explained the book part by part, is very good. And again, there's more. Well, maybe we mention one more. Many of us, we come across the book Al-Jami' al-Saghir, or Sahih al-Jami', Shaykh al-Albani's book. He authenticated the hadith Qaadir al-Suyuti. So it's a big book, hadith, all things authentic, and then one is da'if, all da'if ones. And that book took Shaykh al-Albani a lot of time and effort to gather it, because Imam Suyuti was trying to gather all the hadith sahih, all the hadith da'if. So he called it Jami' al-Saghir. Shaykh al-Albani divided into two, Sahih al-Jami' and Da'if al-Jami'. Many of us probably see hadith. You see a poster, it says Sahih al-Jami'. What is that? Shaykh al-Albani is checking Imam Suyuti's collection. So there is a commentary, Faisal Qaadir it's called. Faisal Qaadir, Sharh بشرح جامع الصغير, Imam al-Munawi. Al-Munawi, Faisal Qaadir it's called. The commentary on Jami' al-Saghir of Imam al-Munawi. This was a good book to know, because if you find one of those hadith which is very rare, Sahih Jami' has very interesting hadith, never heard before. Shaykh al-Albani says Sahih. You want to wonder, what does the hadith mean? Faisal Qaadir. And when I will tell you, leave it a little bit. And the San'ani also has a sharh as well, Taysir al-Qadir, I think it's called. But anyways, you can go to these books. So why is it important to know? Because when you come across the hadith, the reason why we're talking about all this, you want to check the meaning. You don't want to read hadith and say, well, I'm gonna. And you wonder, how does someone know what it means? They go to those books. We forgot Muwatta Imam Malik, Imam Malik's al-Muwatta, right? Amongst the first books of hadith. There are many commentaries, and two of them written by Imam Ibn Abdul Barr. They are considered the best. So Imam Malik's Muwatta is very small, but the best commentary in that book, At-Tamheed, by Imam Ibn Abdul Barr, or Al-Istidkar, both of them by him. And the reason why it's important, if you find a hadith there, you want to maybe check, again, that book At-Tamheed is a massive book, a very detailed book, but again, it's a reference, these are reference books. The only reason why we mention all of this, and again, the contemporary scholars have contributed plentiful as well, so it's not like we don't go to them as well. Like Shaykh Abdul Abad al-Badr, today of our time, Muhaddith al-Medina, rahimahullah, he did all 6 books of hadith, and he's continuing. Although now he's very ill, he hasn't been doing as much, but he commented on all 6 books of hadith. That's valuable. You can listen to the whole sharh, everything, and he'll give you some benefits. That's another place you can look. And many scholars have done that too. They commented. Shaykh Uthaymeen has many commentaries on hadith. Some he finished, some he didn't finish. Now let's talk about hadith ahkam. Many of us, we know the hadith about fiqh. Usually people go to Umdat al-Ahkam or Bulugh al-Maram. The books are many, but when it comes to Umdat al-Ahkam, you can go to many of them. But Shaykh Abdullah Bassam, his shuruh, his sharh is very easy. Abdullah Bassam. Taysir al-Allam. This book is very easy. Or Bulugh al-Maram, you go Subul al-Salam, San'ani. But sometimes it's hard. So if some book is hard for you, go to a smaller book. It's okay. For example, Ibn Uthaymeen commented on it. As long as somebody commented from their scholars, it's fine. But the benefit though is that you want to read the commentaries in levels, the beginner one to the more advanced one. because you can't do without the advanced ones. But what you don't want to do is you read a hadith, no commentary. This is between the talib ilm and the ami. Any hadith you come across, you can't understand it your way. What did the imam say before? What does it mean? And this is when you learn if this hadith means wajib, or recommended, or prohibition, or dislike. All those differences people have, it's all in the books of hadith. They explain it. Now the problem, we didn't go there. So the benefit behind this is that when you come across something like a hadith or an ayah, you check the commentaries first. To first develop a correct understanding, to which then you can branch out to research more or to think about it more. So for example, let's say you want to put together some benefit, or you want to put together a khutbah. You go to get an ayat, put ayat on the topic, a hadith on the topic, then what do? The ayat, you go, tafasir. You check different tafsir, you bring some benefit. If it's a hadith, okay, which book is it? Bukhari, Fath al-Bari, Muslim, Nawawi, Abu Dawood, Azim al-Badi, that's where you go. So you comment, you get the hadith, and you get the commentary from them. You want to summarize what they said, as long as you have the understanding of it. Because some hadith, you get it, and you figure out it's not a proof for you. What you're trying to prove, it doesn't work. The commentators explain otherwise. It's okay, that's not a proof. I have to erase that. But you see the difference between someone who just grabs the Quran or hadith and makes a case, and there's nobody who's backing that case. No one's behind you there. That's a problem. It's not peer-reviewed. Nobody Sheikh said that. And this is when you find that even the ulama, some of their books are just that. They gather ayat, hadith, and they put commentary on it, khalas, finished. Well, what they do, they keep commenting more, right? And later, as you grow in your research, you're going to bring some aqwal, some evidence, supplementary evidence. So you bring the ayah, you bring the hadith, and you bring this Sheikh's statement, and you bring this Sheikh's statement, and this benefit. So you're making a bigger case of what you already small, something small became big. And now suddenly you have an article. They keep going, you have a book. And that's the benefit behind research, because you're going to gather evidences, but also you're going to see how the evidences sometimes can be one thing, could be something else. And sometimes you come across two hadith, you think they're contradictory, right? That's the beginning. We must say, oh, this hadith, I thought this was the correct understanding, or I thought this is what it meant. The commentator will tell you, there's another hadith like this, but it actually means this. See, they do the work for you, the heavy lifting, so you don't have to worry. And that's why they benefit the ulama, they bring the wordings. See, all the hard work they're already doing for you. But imagine you didn't know this. And what are you going to do when you're doing an ayah hadith? You're just going to recite it. You have to make sure that the case you're trying to make or the point you're trying to prove is established in that. So in essence, everything you're studying, we always do our homework before we make our statements. That's what Talib Ilm is trying to do. Essentially, we're trying to study to figure out what's the correct understanding. The same way, if I want to figure out something's right or wrong, I start off without any presupposition. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I'm going to check what the ulama say, and I'm going to read their statement, and I'm going to figure out from there if this is right or if this is wrong. But if I come in the beginning with a bias and say this is wrong, then I'm going to ignore the evidence that don't go with what I'm saying. So that's why it's important to understand the books you go back to. And scholars, they mention this because later when you're researching, now you found the hadith, now you know where to look just to get the commentary. If you're still confused or it doesn't make sense, okay, so maybe I'm going to ask somebody else. Maybe he come across something else. Because again, there's more books. For every book, there's multiple books of explanation. I'm just talking about the best one in the field. And this also leads us to another point. Every subject you're studying in Islam, they're interconnected. So in the books of hadith, when they explain the hadith, how are they going to explain it? They're going to explain it from Arabic language, from fiqh, usul of fiqh, from aqeedah. They're going to bring everything that's underneath it. So that's why sometimes some of the books, you read the commentary, you get confused. Why? Because the sheikh's going to go in. He's writing a commentary. It's not necessarily for me and you. It's for anyone who wants the hadith. So he's going to comment on it and he's going to go in levels. Some scholars, they just stick to the hadith, just the basic meaning of the hadith, simple. But something like Fath al-Bari ibn Hajar, he's going to go in the deep end, right? He's going to go starts with the wordings of the hadith. Some they go to i'rab al-hadith. If maybe an ayn is Umdat al-Qari, he starts with the hadith, then the wording, then the i'rab. SubhanAllah, he's going, before he even gets started the hadith, going all here. Some of us, we're looking at it, where's the commentary? It's too much stuff going on here. But there is the commentary, that's what he's looking for. But most of us, what we're looking for, I just want to know what the hadith means. So you're not going to read that book then. You're going to read a bit smaller book. It's going to give you a tariqat, very small one. But imagine, I want to know what this hadith, and what is it, and who misused it, and how to respond. All that beautiful stuff. So there is a benefit then, that sometimes when you're reading books, you have to be careful. You're reading an advanced book, and you're not at that level, because some stuff you will not appreciate or understand. For example, Tafsir, Ibn Kathir is the best tafsir after Tafsir Imam Tabari. It's the best tafsir. It's a summary of Tabari and additional things, but it's the best scholars they say. Again, more than one scholars they say this. So Tafsir ibn Kathir, what's unique about it? He brings you Quran, Hadith, Arabic, correct Aqidah, brings you history, brings so many benefits. But it's full of evidences, Hadith especially, and brings good discussions. Some of the terminology he uses is very difficult. He'll bring you a Hadith, doesn't tell you it's authentic necessarily, or he'll bring you some different viewpoints. Sometimes you get confused. I don't know what he's saying there. That's why scholars say, like, well, if you don't know too much Hadith, you don't know too much about the ulum al-tafsir, maybe you don't want to read Ibn Kathir first. You're not going to appreciate it. You're not going to appreciate it. Maybe go down to Sa'di, get a tafsir ijmali, summarized version, then learn some hadith sciences, learn a little bit, and then come back. Some tafsir books, they're more focused on language. When you read it, full of Arabic language and balagha, and you're like, if you don't know it, you don't benefit. So the reason why it's important to know that is that you have to also understand knowledge is interconnected. Hence, the student of knowledge, he has to make sure he spreads the base ground, covers himself on the basics before he tries to go above. Hence, what we said before, the strategy of studying a little bit of every subject, then layering it with the next layer of the same subject, then going up. This is much better than studying one subject and going all the way in the deep end, from beginner to advanced, and you don't know anything about another subject. Why? Because you won't be able to benefit from other books. So for example, to study fiqh, you need to know hadith, because the hadith has to be authentic before we study the fiqh. So imagine you don't know the hadith, and scholars say the hadith is da'if. You're like, oh, can I build something on that? Okay, first I should study both of them. Or how about I'm going to study, for example, Arabic. Why am I studying all this Nahu and I'rab? So then when the hadith comes and the khilaf on the meaning, they might be using Nahu to figure out what's the correct meaning. I can appreciate the discussion. So sometimes it's important to us to understand that patience is necessary in order to appreciate the classics. Sometimes, because we don't understand these different sciences, we might not appreciate the earlier scholars. And then the same problem also comes when people try to skip all the sciences and then try to quote these bigger books and they don't understand them. They don't understand them, they don't know what they mean, they don't know what the Shaykh was saying and his language is using, and then you're going to be embarrassing yourself. You find people today, everyone can quote Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah, but probably it's not in the proper quotation. But Shaykh Islam Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, he wrote a lot and he said a lot of different things in different places. So there's a methodology to study his books. You can't just say Ibn Taymiyyah said, where he said, what book is that, what year is that, what else did he write in it? You better be ready. Someone's going to bring another statement, he said opposite. He khalas. And that happens so often. Someone said Ibn Taymiyyah says, and he said that. Okay, now I can mix tahrir, fix the issue, you can't. So why misquoting, why coal mining? And you find this today, people do this a lot. And this is another problem that we also later on will have to eventually realize that when it comes to talking to people and trying to teach them, you also need to make sure you read a lot of different things. And this is another thing I want to finish with the studies. Generally speaking, you're in a curriculum, you focus on what you're focusing on, and then you have time on the side to read. Student knowledge has to read a lot. Brothers and sisters, a lot. When I say a lot, it means you're always reading every day. Some of the ulama, they put numbers like 100 pages a night. Adi, and it should be easy. And again, there's a qissa, one shaykh with the talib, when they were in the munaqasha, the PhD, he's doing his PhD in the discussion room. And then I think it was Abu Zaq al-Badr, and he told the student, well, you missed this, you missed that, it's in this book. He said, Shaykh, I didn't have time to review. 100 pages, you didn't have time? Talib ilm doesn't have time, 100 pages? Like, this is reality. He got him off guard. PhD, he got everything ready, but he said, no, this one, you missed this and that, and he's thinking like, oh. And it's true, because ultimately, he's expecting him to be better prepared. But obviously, that shows you students, the scholars, they're always reading. But also the idea of making sure you're reading different subjects, and there's free reading you can do after you finish your curriculum, or on the evenings, reading different books. Some books are not in the curriculum, but you can still read them. So the idea is, reading is important, so to gather these different views, and later these benefits will come helpful when you're studying something. But most people, when you look at it, the beginning is you study, and later on you can do more. But if you also make sure that you're reading, you can't just be studying your books. So that means at home, finish what you did for today, memorization, whatever, and then you have some time, spend that. Go download some books or get a book open, read something. And read it, benefit. There's some books you don't need a prerequisite for. Anyone can read it. And Ibn Qayyim, some of his books, there's no prerequisite. Bible al-Sayyib, anyone can read it. It's a very beautiful book in Adhkar. Beautiful fawaid, Dawa Dawa, anyone can read it. Tariq al-Hijratain, if you read these books, just gonna, Risala Tabukiyya, you read it, just gonna sit there and say, mashallah. Benefit your life. It doesn't have nothing really to do with your studying, but benefits your iman. So it's important to read these different things so you can have more knowledge about different topics. And sometimes something comes up, you want to think, well, I want to know about this. That's after you finish what you're supposed to be doing. But the problem, though, is if you're not reading these different books, you might also missing out and some thaqafa, some cultural or heritage that every Muslim should know. And that's another thing that we have to be careful of, that we're trying to become tulab ilm, not the people of thaqafa. And the ulama, they talk about this muthaqifin, people who just know thaqafa, they know a little bit of everything but nothing really. There are people like that, right? They know a little bit of everything but they know nothing. Then he couldn't tell you something straight, he just tells you a little bit of everything. So that person's cultured, we say. Cultured person, but he's not knowledgeable. Because you ask him, what's the qawl sahih? He doesn't know, he just knows there's a qawl there. There's a qawl here, I read that here. He says he's everywhere. So some people, they look like this. Mashallah, he knows all these different names, but I said, okay, Dan, what's the correct view? He doesn't know. So it's not talib ilm necessarily. But also, it's not good for talib ilm not to be one who has some kind of background. And talib ilm is only studying aqeedah, tawheed. Yeah, okay, this is good, but also he has some time for little other things here and there. Why? Because then he needs to know more things. It's like when you're studying your subject in university college, there's a core subject, and what they call the other one? The breadth courses or electives. Yeah, you see? Walk around, just know engineering all day, that's it. You know calculus? You're going to operate in the world? They make you study biology. And there's no wisdom behind it, Allahu A'lam, but then they want to make it harder. But most times, they probably want you to know live in the world, right? It's true. You don't want someone who's talib ilm who doesn't know geography. Or worse, which is a big problem, which is that some of the masail ilmiyyah that are here in front of us today, they're dunya related. And that's the vision the student has to have. Later on, look at some of the fiqh issues connected to the dunya. New issues, the nawazil, obviously we're not trying to pass fatwa. I need to understand what's going on, what's all this crypto and AI, and I have to know this. Not necessarily on my own, but if I want to understand it first, I want to see what the ulama are also saying. And some of the buhuth, the ulama write, the research, they first start off with that. They're debating these issues first. What is this thing? Then the hukum. And it shows you the end day that there's also kind of learning that we all have to be doing. Economics, and that's why you'll see later, some knowledge, as you get more into studies, you have to learn them so that you can better prepare to help people in the community who might have those issues or might be this. And later, obviously, there are issues regarding responding to people who might have fallen to misguidance even. There are people who fall misguided, maybe you need to know something to help them, and that's more advanced. At the beginning, when you have free time, you read. Student knowledge, that's his pastime. And there are books to help you. Shaykh Abdul Sadhan, he has a kitab, كيف تقرأ, how to read, كيف تحفظ, and how to memorize. And I forgot the last one, I mentioned كيف تفهم, يعني, how to understand. There's a risala, it's a small book. Shaykh Abdul Sadhan from Saudi has this book. It's nice. How to read, how to understand, how to memorize. In that book, it teaches you how to read, different books to read, what's reading look like, fast reading. And when you read what the ulama read, you also appreciate the reading culture. Important student knowledge, because the books are coming out in the volumes. We have to read, right? So we have to read, even if it's small books, and now we have PDFs, print version, lectures, whatever. Student knowledge has to busy themselves with it, with their curriculum, not at the expense of the curriculum. Because you can't just say, I'm reading freely, that's not a curriculum. But you also have time, you read. And that's the lost art nowadays, right? People are listening and reading, watching. We have to read. We have to read, brothers and sisters. It's very important because the ulama always say, reading is where the knowledge is. Listening compared to reading is more beneficial. Majority of knowledge is in the reading. After the lessons, it's in the books. Because the amount of detail they go in, the lecture can't get in. It can't. And this is one of the things that is important. Even the sheikhs, they will not tell you everything. They'll tell you what's something, and you have to go and do the rest of the reading, the required reading. So it's important that we read, and we also inspire to try to make a habit of reading. Some tulab ilm, you see them, they always have a book in their bag. That's how it should be. You always have a book on your phone or your bag. You always have something to read. And why? Because you're growing your knowledge, reviewing it. Some of the sheikhs, you see them, the way that they read, the libraries, the size of it. That's what they're doing. But that's also how they're gaining this knowledge, also preserving it by learning more. But us, it's just about reading, getting the kind of habit. Small books, you start with the small ones, the bigger ones. And then you can read in English and Arabic. If you know how to read in Arabic, mashallah, read them. And read in English. Even English, there's a lot of good books in English. That's where you start. If you don't know how to read Arabic, read English books. And read them, benefit. Now there's PDFs. If you can't afford the books, people say, I can't afford it. But they are expensive. Okay, get the PDF. But then we learn later, it's not about the price, right? Because the book is free and you still don't read it. Right? So sometimes this is what we find, we tell ourselves, oh, I can't afford it. This was before. Right? So if it's there, download it and read it. It's important. And some reading doesn't have to be the same. Some people like to read the whole book, beginning to end. Some people read chapters. Again, everyone's different. But you start with the back of the book, check the index. But you have to read, brothers. It's very important. Especially in today's time, when there's so much available to us, and good books have been translated, it's necessary that we're aware of them And that's why the habit of reading and making it a habit amongst the brothers. And we get together, we also talk about what we read and what we came across. This should be our habit. Is what you read this week, what you came across. I listened to this, I heard this. That's the fawaid. When you get together, you didn't read nothing. It's like, what are we doing? What are we wasting our time with? And you find this today that if we're not doing this, not only is it going to make us more, not in depth in our knowledge, but also we find that probably we're going to struggle doing the prerequisite reading. Because if we're not doing the recommended reading or extra reading, how about the ones that we're supposed to? So make it a habit to read. There are many good books to read. Inshallah, maybe next time after Ramadan, we'll talk about some of those books that are recommended reads, the ulama advise. And there are also books that are not allowed to be read. We finish with that. There's some books haram to read because they have danger in there. Some books are disliked to read. Some books are better to delay. So for example, history is good to read, but the beginning stages is not preferred for a student to be busy with history as a curriculum. But if you want to read after, you can read it in free time. History is beneficial. Anyone can read history. There's a low entry point. Anyone can read it. But as a curriculum, it's not the curriculum. That's why you find most curriculums, they don't mention history. Why? Something you do on the side. You read the books of history, you benefit yourself. But it's recommended for a student to know history. So you would not tell someone you're going to study the history books. No. You have time for your sleep or have free time, you open some history books. Figure out what happened in the Ummah. What's the Abbasid? What's the Umayyad? Yeah, some stuff, sometimes it gets embarrassing, right? We don't even know what's going on in the Ummah. And the timeline shouldn't be so bad. What year are we in? What time was Rasulullah? Some people have wrong timing. They don't even know the dates. And also some of the things you learn in history allow you to also understand the reality we're in. So that's why they give free time, you can fill in those things, but it shouldn't be the curriculum in the beginning. Just the same with the ulama, they don't ever tell people delay the aqeedah studies because those things are wajib. So that's what we talked about before. You have to put what's in front of you, but in the free time you can do a bit. Inshallah, we'll end with this much. If anyone has any questions, we'll take it. Memorizing and reading. So obviously a person has to memorize and a person is going to read. Because the whole day is not going to be memorization. In reality, there's going to be time after the memorization when he's free. That's the time for the reading. So you can do both. And I think a lot of times we don't realize that we're not going to spend the whole day memorizing. Maybe if it takes a lot of time, then at the end, a little bit of reading. But you can't say I'm going to just memorize, no reading. Or reading, no memorizing. No, you have to do both. Do what you have to memorize, especially at night. Because memorization, especially people, they know they're energetic in the morning, or at least the early days. Some people do better at night, but most people might find themselves getting tired at night. At night, you just do the reading. You can fall asleep. It's okay. Because it's free reading. But you're not going to say, I'm going to memorize and I'm going to fall asleep on it. Right? So, but you find that many people say, I can't do both. You can. Because the commitment for reading is just opening the book and reading it. And benefiting. Not necessarily studying it, but just reading it. And subhanAllah, some books are just beneficial just to read. So I definitely think you can combine. And a person should have that habit, because how many hours a day is someone really seeking knowledge? Full-time talib al-ilm is doing the whole day. Some of the shuyukh do 17 hours a day. I think the Ashaq Sa'ad said, what are you doing free day time? We have nothing to do. He said, stay in my library, 17 hours. That's 17 hours. That's how many waking hours? Every waking hour. And that's how you notice they're free. They have nothing to do. But obviously they're doing research and all kind of things. But us, we're not. If full-time talib ilm, he's doing 8 hours minimum. A full shift, full time. But most of us are not full-time talib ilm. So how many hours? Let's say you're doing 2-3 hours a night. Okay, how much is memorization? How much is reading? Reading, you do a little bit, then memorize more. So you can do that. But if you imagine to yourself the all 3 hours of memorizing, it's not the reality. You can check for yourself. You'll find that most time you're not doing even 3 hours of anything. Right? So that's what the problem. We have to be careful. So we trick ourselves out memorizing. You're not even doing that. And then when you restrict the time, it also tends to push you to do more. And I think it's better to do reading late, like this. When you finish everything, nothing to go on, you pick up a book, just review it. It's very beneficial. You can combine. Anyone else have any questions? طيب, inshallah. We're going to continue with Arabic, inshallah ta'ala. سبحانك وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.